Padnani. I'm an editor on the Obituaries desk at the New York Times. And I'm the creator of a project called Overlooked, which tells the stories of remarkable women and people of color who never got a New York Times obituary since we started publishing in 1851. I rehearsed this talk last night to my cat and she fell asleep, but I'm really hoping you guys will find this more engaging. So my story kind of begins with this workshop that I took in 2017. It's called the Executive Leadership Program, and it's by the Asian American Journalists Association. That's me and my classmates right there. So the focus of the program was that leadership is a behavior, not a role. So it doesn't matter if you're a manager or an underling, if you have direct reports or if you don't. If you have something you want to achieve for yourself, you can get it done no matter what position you're in. They also talked a lot about diversity and the importance of diversity in newsrooms so that you can have diverse newsroom coverage and reach wider audiences. So that really resonated with me, and when I returned to work after this, it was January 2017, I had just started on the obits desk, and it was right around the time when the national debate on race was at a rolling boil with Black Lives Matter, and the conversation on gender inequality was just starting to bubble up again. And so I wondered, as a journalist and as a woman of color, what could I do to help advance this conversation? People were coming out of the shadows to tell stories of injustices that they had faced, and it really resonated with me as a woman of color growing up in New York City. And so I noticed around this time that we started getting these emails from readers saying, hey, why don't you have more women and people of color in your obituaries? And I thought, yeah, why don't we? I never noticed before, but the page is a sea of white men. And so even more surprising was the attitude among some of my colleagues. You know, when I joined, I was actually one of 2 women on the obits desk out of around 10 or 12 people, and the only person of color. And so their attitude was a little dismissive. They said, oh yeah, we just get these emails sometimes. But I really wanted to know, had they ever thought about why this was? And so I asked my boss about it. I said, so why is it that we don't have more women and people of color in our obituaries? And he said, well, the people who are dying today are from a generation when women and people of color weren't invited to the table to make a difference. So talk to me in a generation or 2 and you'll automatically see more women and people of color in our obits. But that answer just wasn't satisfying. So I wondered how many of our obits were about women. Any guesses on a percentage or? So far, I heard 15%, that's kind of the closest so far. 20%, 1 in 5 of our obits were about women. In 2016, that was really disappointing. And so I wanted to know, where are all the dead women? So I started looking at our research process. How do we hear about people who have died? The number one way is through reader submissions. And it's my hunch that we hear more from women talking about men because women are sort of the glue of society, they're the gatherers. And so women would write to us and say, my husband died, my father died, my son died. But we didn't hear so much from the men saying, my wife died or my mother died or that sort of thing. We also would hear from wire services, other newspapers, social media, and a website called legacy.com. So legacy.com rounds up obituaries from about 700 newspapers around the world. And so I wondered, well, where are these newspapers? And I found a map on their website. The newspapers were in Canada, Ireland, Australia, the United States, all these sort of white-dominated countries. So I thought, is there a way we can look at newspapers from Asia, Africa, Latin America in our daily report? So I started working with a woman at the research desk to see if there was a way we could automatically fold this in and make it very clear and obvious to all of my colleagues. So all this was sort of swirling around in the back of my mind when one day I came across a website talking about Mary Outerbridge. She was credited with introducing tennis to America in 1874, right on Staten Island in our backyard. And I thought, wow, how neat is that? One of the biggest sports in America was introduced by a woman. I wonder if she ever got a New York Times obituary. Spoiler alert, she did not. I jumped into Times Machine. If you've never been in Times Machine, it's a fascinating place to explore. It's basically the digitized version of every New York Times newspaper, starting from the day we started publishing, September 18th, 1851, until around 2002. So this tool came in really handy as I started wondering who else we missed. I began asking some of my colleagues, do you have any ideas? And they all thought about people in history who had inspired them. They said, how about this person? How about that person? And so I would jump into Times Machine to see if they got an obit. And if they didn't, I would add those people to a list. And so then I went back to my boss and I said, well, what do you think if we tell these stories now? And he said, oh, no, we just do regular obituaries, that's it. We don't do anything else. We don't have the time or resources. But I was placed on Obits as the digital editor, the first full-time digital editor, in a very print-oriented, traditional news desk. And so it was really my job to help them bust out a tradition, at least as far as digital. It only made sense to me that I would also think of ways to get them to think differently with regards to diversity. So I was still looking for ways to do this when I was approached by an editor named Monica Drake. Today, she's the first Black female masthead editor at the New York Times. But back then, she was on a committee to redesign our print pages. And so she said to me, if I gave obits an extra page in print every day, would you guys be able to fill it? I said, well, I had this idea for this series. Maybe that could fill the space. She said, I love it. That's way more than a space filler. And so she went and she told all the top editors at the New York Times about this, and this enthusiasm just started bubbling up all around me, and even my boss got swept into it. So like, I didn't have to worry about that anymore. And so we started to look deeper as we were pushing forward with the series. We found some other surprises on who else we missed. There was Ida B. Wells, a pioneering journalist who started the campaign against lynching. The brilliant poet Sylvia Plath never got an obit. Emily Warren Roebling, who helped finish the Brooklyn Bridge when her husband, the engineer, became ill. And so we launched on March 8th, 2018, that's International Women's Day, with the stories of 15 remarkable women in history. And I knew that the series was powerful, but I didn't expect the reaction to be equally powerful. I came in the next day, and I had something like 200 emails. And they were, usually when I get 200 emails, 199 are deletable, and one is for me. But in this case, I couldn't find any to delete. They were all for me. I'm like, okay, I gotta dig in. I got emails from readers saying, thank you for giving these women a voice. From people who said, I cried on my way to work reading these stories because I felt seen for the first time in a long time. I heard from colleagues of mine who said, I never thought another woman of color would be allowed to achieve something like this at the New York Times. And I heard from radio stations and newspapers and TV stations that wanted to interview me. And so here's a sampling of some of the interviews. The girl on the top right wanted to interview me while we were running. So I like to run, not usually while talking about the story of my life. It's very difficult. But anyway, so when I thought about it, it made sense. Obituaries to us are news stories, but to other people, they really are more about life than about death. They're the last opportunity that you have to really talk about somebody's contribution to the world and to society. And so they're really meaningful for our readers. So we even put out a reader submission form saying, why don't you tell us who else we missed? And to date, there are 4,000 submissions. So lucky for me, the series is still going on. And I was hoping I could tell you about some of the reader submissions. This one is my absolute favorite. This is Grandma Gatewood. She survived 30 years of domestic violence at the hands of her husband. One day, it was so bad, he beat her beyond recognition and broke a broomstick over her head. And so she threw a handful of flour in his face in response, and when the police arrived, they arrested her, not him. But then the mayor saw her in jail and decided to take her into his own home until she could get back on her feet and get a divorce. And then she read an article in National Geographic about how no one person, man or woman, had ever hiked the Appalachian Trail in its entirety alone. And so she said, you know what, I'm gonna do this. And for those of you who don't know, the Appalachian Trail is a 2,000-mile trail going all the way from Georgia to Maine. So she took very little with her, shower curtain for the rain, she took a comfortable pair of shoes, some snacks, and she set about her way. And then these reporters heard about the old lady who was hiking in the woods, and there she would be traipsing across the evening news, and people would see it at the dinner table thinking, gosh, if this 67-year-old great-grandma can hike, maybe I can too. They were all inspired. And so at the finish, there was a camera crew waiting for her, and they said to her, how did you survive so rough a place? But they had no idea what she had survived before then. In fact, it was only revealed way after her death that she had suffered through all that abuse. Another favorite of mine is Minnie Freeman. She was a school teacher in Nebraska in 1888 when there was a freak blizzard. It was so warm that morning, everybody left their jackets at home. But then when the kids were in school, the clouds came in and the sky grew dark, and all the teachers wondered what to do. So one teacher sent the kids home early. Another one kept the kids in overnight. But in Minnie Freeman's classroom, the wind had already blown away the door and the roof. So she looked around, she found some twine, she wrapped it around all the school children and around herself, scooped up the littlest one, and led them a mile into safety in the blizzard. And so she was called Nebraska's fearless maid, and she got something like 200 marriage proposals after that. So you never know. And this was suggested by a reader who's a school teacher in Nebraska, who said, I was inspired by Minnie's story, especially now at a time when teachers are expected to leap into bravery in scary situations. So Overlooked has become wildly popular, and it's becoming a book and a TV show at some point. Thanks. Thank you. So we partnered with this agency in LA, and I actually went out to Hollywood last July to pitch the TV show to some networks. And the agency created for us something called a Sizzle Reel. It's like a trailer kind of describing what we expect the show to be. It would be an anthology, 10 episodes, each one an hour long, each one about a different woman. And so it's going to be written by women, directed by women. And I was hoping I could show you this Sizzle Reel. You'll see some familiar faces in there. Those are actresses who have expressed interest in being a part of this. So like Emma Stone wants to direct the one on Sylvia Plath. Frida Pinto hopes to get involved in the one on Madhubala, who is a Bollywood star. So take a look. I think who gets remembered and how inherently involves judgment. It's news judgment, but it's still some form of judgment. And to look back at the obituary archives can paint a picture of what society valued and who.
The Free Speech, Memphis, Tennessee, May 21st, 1892. Colored man was found lynched, but so little attention was paid to the matter that not only was no record made as to why these last two men were lynched, but even their names were not given. If this work can contribute in any way toward arouse the conscience of the American people to demand for justice to every citizen, I shall feel I have done my race a service.
Marsha P. Johnson is the Rosa Parks of the LGBT movement.
Darling, I want my gay rights now!
When I became a drag queen, I started to live. People in the gay community, they just didn't have nobody to help them out, and they were down and out.
Now let's not be pessimistic. Our love is worth.
And as long as gay people don't have their rights, I don't want 20 more years of this. I'm dying, but I ain't dead yet.
Last Monday, the American poetess and wife of Ted Hughes died suddenly in London. She was 30. She published her first and highly accomplished book of poems, The Colossus, in 1960. But it was only recently that the peculiar intensity of her genius found its perfect expression.
Mother, you sent me to piano lessons and praised my arabesques and trills, although each teacher found my touch oddly wooden. I learned elsewhere from muses unhired by you, dear mother.
अब मैं किसी की निगाहों का सामना नहीं कर सकती। मुझे इस हुजरे में बंद रहने दो। तुम बंद रहो, मुझ में तो इतनी हिम्मत है।
Why is it so quiet? What are they hiding? Why is it so quiet? What are they hiding?
Obits are about life. They're little nuggets of history. They're relatable, they're interesting, often about things you never knew. I think that's why people love them so much.
Can't wait to see that TV show. Like, see this whole thing come to life. So, one of the curses of being an ambitious person is that you're rarely satisfied. And that's kind of the case with me. Yes, Overlooked is great. It's meant so much to a lot of people, but it doesn't really solve my problem. I wanted to fix obits going forward. This is a retrospective history project. And so I wondered what I could do about this, and I figured, let me start by gathering some data. So I went to our archives. It's in this sub-level of the basement. We call it the morgue. And we have millions of old newspaper clippings, 6 million old photographs, tons of goodies. And so I talked to Jeff Roth, who's our archivist, and he referred me to this book called New York Times Obituaries Index, 1858 to 1968. And in it, there's the headline of every single obituary that ran in that time frame. So then we handed it to the New York Genealogical Society, and they digitized it for us. And a programmer at the New York Times wrote up a little program that would scan through all the headlines for Mr., Mrs., lady, sir, all these sort of gender-defining terms. And what we found was that about 20%, between 10 and 21% of our obits were about women from 1851 until 2017. That was really disappointing. We had never gone above 21%. And so I then worked with another programmer to build this sort of tool. It's very dry, it's called the diversity analysis tool, but it's immensely helpful for us. Basically, it automatically tallies up all the obits by gender breakdown, men versus women, month to month. Before we had this tool, this is how I would calculate it. So it saves me a ton of time and energy. Not only that, anybody on my team can jump in and look at it themselves, so I don't have to be the resident nag. The other good thing about this is I asked that programmer to put in a goal. That's the number on the top right. It's an algorithm that tells us what we need to get to 30%. So from March of 2018 to March of 2019, 1 year from when Overlook launched, I was hoping we could get to 30% since we had never done that before. And we actually did. We got to about 33%. So that was awesome. But I'm hoping the next year we can get to 35% and then 40% and just keep going up until we reach parity. And I also hope to work with this programmer this year to create a similar tool for people of color in our obits. It's a little harder to measure, but I think it'll be really valuable. And in fact, that was something that still kind of bothered me about Overlooked, was I really wanted to get men of color in the project. And I got to do that with Black History Month this year. We did a special section looking at about a dozen Black men and women. And there were, again, some surprises. Scott Joplin never got an obit, the composer. Margaret Garner, she was a slave who killed her own baby so that she wouldn't have to grow up into slavery. Her story was the subject of Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved. And when the Overlooked obituary ran, people wrote to us saying, oh my gosh, I never even knew Margaret Garner was a real person. So the other thing I wanted to do was try to find a way to get other men of color in this project. Black History Month is really highly celebrated, but not many people know about Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May, unless you're Asian, or Hispanic Heritage Month. I don't even know if you know what it is. It's between September 15th and October 15th. It's a very awkward time. So I figured I don't have to wait for these months. I'm just going to start doing it now. And so I did that a couple weeks ago with the Overlooked obit for S.N. Goenka. He was a Burmese businessman who helped spread mindfulness to the West. And so he would get these headaches, and he couldn't figure out why. And a friend suggested he try meditation. It worked so well that he decided to become a teacher himself, and he decided instead of just teaching monks, I'm going to teach lay people, and he opened up 100 centers worldwide. And so we can really credit him for mindfulness as we know it today. So before I take any questions, I just wanted to impart on you that if you have an idea or a thought for something novel, keep pushing until you can get someone to listen to you. What you say matters, and you have to find a way to get it out there. So, thank you.